die beiden zusammen. Ja, so groß waren die. So. Das war richtig. Ich glaube, das war's. Aber das ist eine Zwiebel. Ja. Und so ein Kaffee. Achso, bei Anders Paradies in diesem Comic-Salon, diesen Schmuck. Das war auch richtig gut. Ach, da habe ich nicht.
I'll entertain you. So we're just waiting a little bit for some audience that we know were coming. My name is Lina Reibe. I'm half Syrian, half Danish, and I live in Lebanon. I'm a comics artist / animator, and I teach animation and motion graphics and some comics courses at the American University of Beirut. And I'm working on, me and George Jad are working on a database for comics in the Arab world, from artists to writers, scriptwriters, to publishers, magazines, publications, albums, and try to cover everything from the early starts in the 30s and 40s in Egypt on. So from that we're generating different articles about the comics that are in the Arab world. Okay, and I'd like to make a little note that even though I say comics in the Arab world, it's a little bit of a generalization because it covers mostly the region of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, the Gulf states as a focus. There are some mentions to magazines that were published, of course, in the North Africa, the far west, from Morocco and Tunis, but it's far less. So the focus is much more in the near Middle East than the entire region because of many things. First of all, what defines Arabic comics was a bit of an issue. Is it the language? Because you have all the ones in West North Africa who are in French. And then is it the geographical location of being part of the Arab world? Or is it, how about all the people who write Arabic comics or Arabs who publish comics in Europe or in the States? Let's say Zainab Rashid, who's writing about the civil war in Lebanon. It's in French and she's in Paris. So there was a bit of, how to define comics in the Arab world. So to focus myself a little bit, I took that area. And the ones that are written and produced in the Arab world and in Arabic. Okay, so it doesn't mean I'm dismissing the others, it's just this is the focus. Another small point I'd like to say is the majority of comics in the Arab world is published for children in juvenile magazines, mostly magazines, sometimes albums. And so when I'm referring to propaganda and comics, it is addressed towards children from 6 on. Maybe 12, not much more. And so when I'm talking about different ways of the states in having this propaganda, it's almost always children. And the instances that it's not, I will mention it. Okay? So there's very few comics that is addressed towards adults, particularly in the past, nothing before the 80s, 1980s in Lebanon, and of course much more again in North Africa and the West because with their link with France and Europe is much closer, and so they were producing comics that was to the adults a little bit more. And also I'm differentiating no caricature, okay? So sorry for that very long introduction, and hopefully I'll get on with my thing. I'm going to be reading a little bit and hopefully talking at the same time, so if I read too fast, tell me to shut up. Propaganda infiltrates every aspect of the daily life in the Arab world, from political posters to advertising campaigns to children's textbooks in the schools. Everything has a political agenda. The use of comics as a propaganda tool comes as very natural and no surprise to us. During the 1950s, the independence marked the end of the colonization in the Arab nations, and the ideological political parties overthrew the existing systems and installed the totalitarian regimes. These regimes were based primarily on the one-party rule, as you probably are hearing a lot about now. And the mass media was a very powerful tool to use their propaganda to influence the public opinion. Through the various media, they were able to instill their ideals and justify their legitimacy and their continuity. Since the birth, okay, went to sleep, doesn't like me. Okay, since the birth of Arab nationalism, and these are two samples from different periods, 1970, and this is much earlier, in 1952, and I'll explain it. Since the birth of this Arab nationalism after their independence and the development of the cult of the Za'im, the one leader, the Arab countries nationalized the media, taking over the press and the radio and publishing houses and television. So almost all TV stations and radio, and that was owned by the state. And they instituted a virtual state monopoly on the culture. This state-centered approach to culture enforced the central themes of modern propaganda in the Arab world, which were nationalism, opposition to imperialism, and the Palestinian cause, which was omnipresent at all times. Taking advantage of comics as an influential medium, of course, this is an educational tool. Governments used the comics as a platform and started to issue comics from the state, through the state. So state-run children's magazines were issued through ministries of education and cultural institutions run by the political parties in power. So retaining control over the content and ensuring complete support, of course, for their regimes. In addition to the pedagogic and educational ends, comics declared the ideals of socialism, Arab unity, industrialization, and of course anti-Israeli sentiments at different levels, of course. And although comics were produced in many Arab nations, and this I mentioned a little bit, the most influential and the ones that were widely distributed that were produced in Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. Those were distributed more among the Arab states. So what was in the United Arab Emirates was distributed in other Arabic countries, and what was in Egypt was widely distributed. And most of them are, of course, in classical Arabic at the time. Okay, so now we have the rise of nationalism. From the infancy in the 1950s, juvenile comics magazines in the Arab world were produced primarily just for entertainment and education. We have some samples here of Sindibad and Samir, 1956, 1958, magazines that were produced in Egypt, and both of them are Egyptian, and have Sinbad, of course, stories from the locality we'll talk about. So with their newfound independence, why is it we never change okay, from the newfound independence and sense of nationalism, the emphasis was always on folklore, local folklore such as Sinbad and Juha and stories, and historical stories from the Arab heritage, and also historical stories of their glorious past. Stories about local folk heroes such as Sinbad or Antar, the warrior who's in the Arab peninsula, or Juha, the comedian, were common themes of the time, and they showed up whether in Iraq or in Egypt or in Syria or in the United Arab Emirates. These themes were present in many of them. So this is Juha, and the Mizmar is an Iraqi magazine, 1970s, and that's in Sinbad on the cover of 1952 magazine from Egypt. Socialist themes, of course, honoring the farmer and the worker and the civil servant, replaced the fairy tales of princes and princesses that were appearing in previous comics magazines before this period. Engaged Arab artists and intellectuals of the time were the people contributing. So they were not necessarily illustrators for children's books. They were the artists who were exhibiting in exhibitions, and intellectuals who were writing in the journals, newspapers. They were the ones who were writing the scripts and the text and the stories. And they contributed to the creation of these comics, and by reflecting their ideals, as they were also part of these regimes. I mean, they were believing heavily in these ideals, and so these ideals were reflected in the work that they made. As the comics was created by Arabs for the Arabs, propaganda was far more effective at the time, because prior to this period there was a lot of imported comics from Europe and the States that was translated. So this period was going through having their own comics made by them, by their local people, or if it's translated, it was sort of adapted. So this familiarity resulted positively, as it set the comics in a local context, as opposed to the imported comics that appropriated from the foreign cultures. It also aided in the popularity of the comics. These are, of course, Superman and Batman in Arabic. That was in, you can see from the style, it's quite old. This is the Lebanese magazine in the middle with the holding the Palestinian, the Fida'i holding the Palestinian flag, and it's called Al-Fida'i As-Saghir, the little freedom fighter. And this is Iraqi magazine with, you have the farmer and the worker united together with the pigeons. And the top one is a very local folklore, Iraqi folklore, that is not something that is translated. So it's a story about the, I think when the what's the ram, the goat, the male goat, when the goat tried to take the moon. Actually, the entire tried to fish out the moon. The propaganda article, when it's translated into Arabic, I named it that sentence. I'll explain a little later.
Was the one where they published?
Just different times, of course. These are early. These are 50s comics that were done more in the 70s. These are around the same time, 70s, approximately 1970s. I'll have more that are very specific. At the peak of Arab nationalism, we have, particularly after the 1967 war with Israel, all media, including juvenile comics and publications, were state-owned at the time, of course, and were created in the service of the war. We have Samir in Egypt, 1967, and this one, the little soldier is, holding his gun, and he's also working in the fields. And you can buy stamps that the money goes to the aiding the war. These are 1967. Of course, we have I'm talking about before, in Egypt, Samir, The Companion, it's a state-run children's comics. It featured comics depicting lessons in popular resistance. المقاومة دروس في المقاومة الشعبية. So they had lessons on how to have a resistance to Israel, and promoted the soldier as the national hero, of course. This was imitated also in Syria by Usama, which means the righteous. They're all boys' names, by the way. Usama, Samir, they're boys' names. In 1969, and the Iraqi magazine called Majallati, which is my magazine, and Al-Mizmar, the flute, in the 1960s. Of course, the classical Arabic was enforced on all these. The older Egyptian had the Egyptian dialect, but they switched to classical Arabic, as this meant a sign of unity among the Arabs. There was the unification and so on. So this was very present in even the language that was used. This is the cover of the Syrian magazine Osama, 1977, with the soldier after the 73 war, of course, but the soldier is always present. And in addition to nationalism, we have the Ba'ath sentiments, were apparent, of course, in the Ba'ath was the ruling party in Syria and Iraq. They appeared in the comics during the Ba'athist regimes. Usama, Al-Mizmar, Majallati, they upheld the socialist values of the Ba'ath regime in Syria and Iraq, such as, of course, Arab nationalism, patriotism, militarism, but also secularism, which wasn't as present in Egypt and so on, and the worship of science and productivity. So you will, of course, have workers, farmers, soldiers prominently featured inside and on the covers. Al-Mizmar is from Iraq, also these two, a war. But on the one on the right, we not only see, of course, the Bedouin, the farmer, but we also have the Mesopotamian heritage characters from the old Iraqi Mesopotamian sculptures on the right top. So they keep this reminding of their own heritage. In Egypt, of course, we had a lot of the pharaohs, but they moved a little bit away from this. The Mizmar and publications in art in Iraq was funded and generously by the government. Images of children looking up to the leader of the nation as the father figure reinforced the notion of the state replacing the family. So there they had the state as the father, you know. We have Majallati Naira, Muhammad Hassan al-Bakr in 1984, and Al-Tali'a, Hafiz al-Asad was in 1984, and I'll show you covers of many magazines with leaders. These are all children's comics magazines, which have, of course, illustration poetry, but also pages on comics. While Majallati stressed modernization and de-emphasized religion, they do not speak of religion in the Ba'athist regimes in the comics. It also fostered tradition, local culture, and appealing to the past glories of Iraq, which were representing Ba'athist sentiments. For instance, tales depicting the Mesopotamian Empire and Al-Mizmar were followed instantly by science fiction stories. So they always had the historical stories, and at the same time you had little science fiction stories about somebody goes to the moon, or robots, or Maqamarat Abqari, a genius, the adventures of the little genius. And they're very present, the science fiction stories, which I don't think we find much in Arabic comics today, much less so. And okay, aware of this immense impact of the popular media, Syria went as far as of banning all other Arabic comics completely. So no comics was allowed to enter Syria except the state-owned comics, Osama, and so children could not see any of the other magazines. United Arab Emirates witnessed the birth of and later the hegemony of the comics magazine called Majid. This was means it's a boy's name, but it means noble and glorious. During the early 80s, it was published by the Ministry of Information in Abu Dhabi. The journal was the work of prominent artists and intellectuals of the regime at the time, collaborating together to serve pan-Arabism ideology, distance from the regime of their homeland. So they didn't agree with what was happening in their homelands. It was Sadat in Egypt, and they were with Nasrites, and so they formed their own magazine with their own little propaganda about their sort of pan-Arabic. It was led by the Egyptian Nasrite journalist and published in the Gulf, away from the control of the Sadat rule in Egypt. And this was very popular and the highest distribution in the Arab world at the time, and continues to be published today. And it's a magazine for all children and all boys and all girls. That's the slogan at the top there. Of course, the logo has changed many times. Syria's Ali Farzat and Egypt's Adli Rizallah, Hijazi Muhyiddin al-Labad were all leading artists in different nations. I mean, Egyptian, Syrian, and different other Arab artists were contributing to this magazine. And they were the leading artists and journalists of the time who were contributing to the political line of the magazine. Ali Farzat, I think you've all heard of him recently in the news when he was beaten up and maimed because of his cartoons in Syria. He's a Syrian caricaturist, and he did comics. This is also in Majid in 1970s. This is Hijazi, and he had Tanabil al-Thalatha. Common themes of Arab solidarity, anti-imperialism, anti-Zionism were presented in Majid, along with the respect for Islam and the local heritage. So this was quite different than the Ba'athist regime, and the continuing moral basis that Islam is the moral basis for social life as well. It was very moderately so. They didn't try to push things, but it was present because it's their conservative society and it was part of their lifestyle. This pan-Arabism, in addition to using the more universal literary Arabic in place of the local dialects, it promoted, okay, we talked about this, that they used the, again, classical Arabic to promote the unity and so on, and but they did permit a unique local production. It was very local in its style and the illustrations and in some of the settings, but the language was classical Arabic. We had they had Zakiya, which was a girl, very unusual at the time for being a hero. She was it was a series in Majid. Political issues were introduced as well to the children, by relating adult politics to the realities of the children's lives. One of the main series of this Majid was Zakiya Dhakiya, which means Zakiya the intelligent. She introduced her young readers every time to issues of politics, science, religion, and information on Arabic culture and traditions through the stories that she tells. I have samples here of different situations about the Ku Klux Klan, about different, I think I have mentioned here. Interestingly, she used photography, was used in this series with the ideological purpose of creating a second level of proof. So that's the reality, and it's proof that what she's saying is true. It was the characters were drawn fictional, and the photography referred to the real. This effective technique was useful in propagating the political ideals of the magazine. So, of course, speaking about the bad treatment of the African Americans in America, and all kinds of different. They spoke about revolutions in South America. So it was a very politicized series that was put in very simplified language so that the children could understand the basics. But of course it was one-sided. Okay, the cult of the Zaim. The ever-present icon of the leader in contemporary Arabic world manifests the rule and creates their legitimacy. Portraits and images of leaders of these regimes are commonly displayed on the walls in all public sectors, of course. You'll have a big poster, a big image that is framed. They're on TV, children's school books, splattered with their picture. Even comics, of course, did not escape this phenomenon. So these are from different streets in Iraq and Syria. Syria, the money in Iraq has the Saddam Hussein. Iraq, why did I say Iraq? Libya on the top, I'm sorry, Libya at the top there. So in comics, so we had Muhammad Hassan al-Bakr from Majallati on Iraq on the cover of Majallati. Of course, Nasser on the cover of Samir many times, but this is one of the very, this is 1970. We have Usama, we have Assad on the cover of Usama in 2007. Of course, his father was on many comics covers earlier, but I just wanted to be there. We had on the cover of Majid, you have the King Zayed I from United Arab Emirates. See, he's floating on the boat. And we have King King Abdullah, excuse me, in Al Hadiqa, which is a Jordanian magazine, and Queen Rania inside. So they're the father, mother figure of the country. And here we come to other things. Not only did they appear on the covers, of course, a number of the cult leaders had their own, were commissioned biographies of themselves in comic format during the 70s and 80s, displaying their political manifestation of the medium. We have Egypt's Jamal Abdel Nasser, Iraq's Saddam Hussein, and former leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. They each issued biographical had biographic comic albums issued in their name. Not all of them issued them by themselves. Of course, this comes as no surprise because the three rulers secured their power as the Zaim through mass media. This is Gaddafi in 1980, it was published, and Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1973. It was after he died, so this one he did not commission. So, of course, using standard propaganda techniques, all the comics books portray humble beginnings. They all started from, very humble beginnings, whether they did or not, of course. Low-income farmer, let's say Bedouin. Their existence being from the people and for the people, for the common good. This is the common thing with all these books, the albums. Their rise to power elevated them to the status of top revolutionary leaders in the world, rooted in the history and collective memory of their country. The three books glorify their lives and present their idealistic goals while ensuring their immortality. Gaddafi is the hero of the book History of Libyan Revolution, Once Upon a Time Gaddafi. It was published in Paris in 1980. It's portrayed as he is portrayed as the new spiritual leader of the revolution and the primary crusader of the Arab unity, Palestinian freedom, and independence from Western hegemony. The narrative of this book employs, of course, vague, sweeping statements of honor and glory and love for country. They're all common. these are repetitively stated in speeches through the narration that he is in there, and which is a typical tool of propaganda. Similarly, the album of Jamal Abdel Nasser, which will show up in Paris, 1973, also presents the Egyptian leader's life in full historical context. It celebrates Nasser's life in legendary speeches, because his orality was very present. As we often see Nasser address his people, as well as other Arab audiences. This album stresses his oral communication as a populist vehicle for his messages. It's notable that the two comics albums were illustrated by European artists and were translated into several languages. So they were written in Arabic, but they were also translated, and they were done by European artists. However, the only album produced locally was the Long Days in Iraq, 1980. It's a fictional piece based on the life of Saddam Hussein, on true events. Important changes are depicted are not in the life of, the changes aren't in the life of the nation, but in the life of the hero. Islamic references and symbols are completely absent, of course, from the book. There is no mosque, there is no any reference. And keeping the myth of Saddam on a secular level and in concordance with the Ba'athist ideology. And the artist was Iraqi artist. Unfortunately, and this is a little intervention, women do not appear in or participate in any of these revolutions and ideals in these comic books. They're only presented at times as supporting the statements or weeping. Women are portrayed as the typical victims. A lone sobbing widow is portrayed in Nasser, only as an appeal to be protected from the indignity and suffering at the hand of the foreigner. Once upon a time, Gaddafi, women appear only on that hand, the right-hand side, in a speech that mentions the important role of women in the construction of the country. The women are standing. Where's this one? This is the only time that women appear in the entire album, almost, and they are listening to his speech, and they don't appear again in the entire book. Their recognition and representation seems to be mere afterthought. Although I'd like to note that during the comics in the Ba'ath period, the comics of the Mizmar and Majallati, women were very present actually in participating in the revolutions and the things, not just in the stars. Okay, now we're coming to a little bit about the religious comics. Besides the governmental institutions, of course, there was religious associations who took advantage of the potential of comics as a vehicle for their propaganda. The restricted layouts and conventional formats made them wider reception, but it also made it very boring and dull language. This is not the sample of that, but I'll show you. The one on the left is Qissat Mar Sharbil from Lebanon. This is more recent, 2003. And the top middle one also, Abu Ayyub. These are tales of the different saints from Lebanon. So it's Christian magazines. And on the right and the middle down is from Mahdi, which is, at the bottom, of course, is from Shia Hezbollah magazine called Al-Mahdi, which I'll talk about. Okay, this is unusual, so I'll just speak a little bit about some of the extremist Christian political magazines, because there are very few, but I need to just go over them before I can move on to the others. This one is the history of the Maronites, Qissat al-Mawarni, 1979 in Lebanon, in the middle of early in the civil war. It was an exception, of course, in the vast landscape of Muslim magazines produced at the time. It depicted the history of the Maronite Christians who were and their historical struggle against the Islamic invasion of the Lebanese territory. Although the album may be considered a mere historical documentation, it is its conception during the sectarian civil war gave it a political weight. Comics was written in colloquial Arabic, which was very unusual for the time, against all the other Arabic comics, which was classical. It's written on purpose to differentiate them. We are not Arabs. Their claim is that they're not Arabs, that they are Phoenicians historically. And so it was on purpose written in Lebanese dialect. The Lebanese roots to the Phoenician, so this conscious choice reflected their ideology, allocating the Lebanese roots to the Phoenicians while denying their Arabic descent. The local dialect made the text also easily accessible, aiding the reader in identifying their point of view and their message. This is the tree, which symbolizes the cedars, of course. The cedar trees symbolizes Lebanon. Also, this was the case in the story called The Story of a Maronite Hero, which tells the story about the Maronite Lebanese president, Bashir Jmayed, whose father was the leader of the political party at the time. This also upheld the Maronite ideology. In Lebanon, only a Maronite can be president. You cannot be president unless you're a Maronite. You can't be if you're a Muslim or any other Christian fraction. It was featured in this was featured only in their political party's magazine, and so the distribution was quite limited to their own people, to active members. So the influence of the magazine was, limited to the area of Christian subordination and did not go beyond the Lebanese borders. But it's completely speeches and all about the Maronite ideology. And this is in 1982. Okay, we're moving on a little bit to politicized Islamic comics, and then I'm almost done. The moderate to the more radical. Comics with an Islamic and Pan-Arab inclination began timidly in the 1970s. Published or sponsored by the state, juvenile comics magazines were all similar in their objective to spread the Islamic religion. They were also similar in their conformism and self-paced limitations. These are Urfan from Tunis, 1985, Bara'am al-Imam from Kuwait, 2006. Oh, why do I have those? Okay. These are the older ones for those. From the feature stories to the fixed sections and the crossword puzzles, there was always Islamic education as a main theme running through the tour journals, from Bara'am al-Imam, which was a supplement of the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in Kuwait, and Al-Firdaus, which was published by the Ministry of Pious Affairs in Egypt, just as samples. The expansion of Islamic periodicals published by independent, non-governmental associations, Islamic associations, appeared in the 1980s with the publication of Al-Muslim al-Saghir in 1984 in Egypt, and Ahmad in 1987, which is still running. It's one of the longest running comics publications in the Arab world. The latter, Ahmad, it's written Ila Jil Muslim, which was for Muslim generation. It was mostly educational, but it upheld the Islamic values. I mean, it didn't push it just held there. So how they spoke to you as even the dress, being covered, girls veiled or covered, and talking about different areas like the Kaaba and how the behavior, the different things that how to pray, etc. was in it. Now we're going to move on. With the decline of Arab nationalism and the rise of political and less moderate Islam, especially after September 11, the region witnessed the spread of comic publications with an more increased Islamic content. With the recent spread of Islamic comics, is quite surprising, because with the supposedly intolerance of Islam towards the visual image or representation of people, it's quite surprising that you have a lot of comics that are heavily radical Islamic that represent people. So you'd expect a decrease in the visual representation. On the opposite is happening. Religious institutions are appropriating the cultural forms rather than eliminating them. This is Al-Mahdi from Lebanon, 2008. And I'll talk about that. Al-Mahdi, which is the man guided by God, also named, but is a Lebanese juvenile publication, which according to its cover is a Boy Scout magazine. The title Al-Mahdi refers to the return of the Imam, of course, in the Shia Islamic ideology. The magazine is run by the political party Hezbollah, which utilize it openly as a vehicle for their propaganda. And this one is 2010, but they started in 2007, I think. 2002, excuse me. While introductory pages are always devoted to words and advice of Iranian spiritual leaders and political leaders, such as Imam Khomeini and Khamenei, they are always illustrated much more realistically. We have the rest of the strips are adventures recounting the exploits of the Islamic resistance, so al-Muqawimun, against the Israeli aggressors, and note that the Nasrallah is in the the bottom of the panel there with on TV being watched. And this is a series about the resistant fighters. There are different pages. They're illustrated, of course, by local people, and some of them are illustrated by Iranians, by the way. The level of illustration is very high and well done, professional, let's say. The stories of, they also had stories of eminent Shia religious history, as well as a series introducing the reader to how to apply Islamic discipline in daily life. Of course, that's the role of the woman. So the women is never in the resistance fighting or in any of those places, although they do contribute to it in reality, but in the comics not. In the comics, it's always in the school or at home, the girl. And it's always with other female members, and it's mostly about how to not to lie to each other, and etc. Strangely, dominantly religious themes placed on the backgrounds of clouds and sunsets portray characters with iconic poses, adding a holy appearance and affirming the religious righteousness of the comics and the cause. I find it very reference to much more iconic Christian iconography. So, I mean, the way the stance reminds you of probably Greek Orthodox rather than, so I think they borrow from other religions to represent. The stories entice the young reader into an illustrated world full of excitement and adventure with clearly defined goals, always paving the way for the preparation of the reappearance of the Mahdi and the freeing Palestine from the Israeli occupation. So that every story always has those at the end. Someone announces, don't forget that the Mahdi is coming and that we should free Palestine. As I spoke, women rarely feature in activism, but are included in the discussion, practical practices in Islam, moral guidance, light issues as lying and boasting, and humor is almost non-existent in this magazine. Not at all. There's one little one that's very humorous, it's extremely cute, but there's not. So, this is Faras al-Ghad. Besides Mahdi, we have other Arabic comics with a fundamentalist religious agenda, and they stand inconspicuously next to other juvenile comics magazines. So if you go to any magazine library, comics, not just comics, bookstore, you'll find all the very commercial magazines and those sitting next to them, and you wouldn't know the difference unless you opened it and looked into it clearly. So Faras al-Ghad is quite professionally done, drawings are great, manga, illustrations, and so on. So the juvenile publication Faras al-Ghad, The Night of the Future, Faras is also a boy's name, 2006, is published in Lebanon, but, wait, Saudi Arabia or Lebanon? I forgot. Openly propagates suicide bombers and the martyrdom in the name of religion while targeting their young audience. So this is called Abtal min Biladi, which means heroes from my country, and this talks about the grandmother of this young boy and her resistance fighting and her decision to tie herself with explosives and blow herself up, and the grandson says, I hope to follow in her path. So, what was I going to say? I forgot. So, the interesting thing is that these magazines really understand the potential of this medium. So they use the professional comics illustrators, which usually weren't, like in Ahmad, it's a little more primitively done and so on. These get quite good illustrators and trendy styles and exciting narratives. They're far more engaging to the young audience than many of the other more moderate ones. Faras al-Ghad, this is 2008. They always depict, of course, historical moments in the Islamic periods of Salah ad-Din and so on. This has also about resistance fighters, but young boys who come together to fight. So, from humoristic, entertaining comics to tales of legendary fighters, as we talked about before, they're smoothly woven together, so every page is a different thing. It's difficult for the reader to notice that he's moved from the story of a picnic to a grandmother who's a suicide bomber. So, in the face of this radical Islamic versions of comics, there's also some efforts made to post-2001 to portray a more moderate and forgiving face of Islam. So one such effort was emerged as a serial comics magazine entitled The 99. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's created by Naif al-Mutawa. He's a Kuwaiti businessman and psychiatrist. And it's based on the 99 names of God. The magazine was inspired by the Muslim faith and culture with no direct allusion to the religion in the stories. It is drawn by accomplished American superhero artists from DC Comics and Marvel. The 99 characters, he went to DC and to Marvel and he got these artists to draw for him. The 99 characters must overcome their obstacles through cooperation and unity. Their power is in their name, so if it's, and each name of the God is a power. So it could be the generous, the forgiving. So their power comes from being generous or being forgiving, and they don't have weapons at all. This is 2008, and I just put this one because this is, I think, the only character that's veiled, but it's created in the style of American superhero comics, sort of, the series. It's translated into English and Chinese and many other languages, distributed in a lot of the Far East. It's an appealing adventure for teenage kids across the world. They're doing a movie and a theme park, I know. They're meant to introduce them the kids to a more moderate version of Islam. Not all the characters are Muslim at all, and notably many of the female characters, of course, are not veiled. So, Hadiyah, thereby making them more accessible also to a foreign audience. In conclusion, with the state-owned magazines no longer run by artists and intellectuals, the comics magazines of the past have been reduced of the state, complete mediocrity in form and content. If you see them, they're terrible. They're remaining just merely as hollow vessels by the tired regimes that created them. This is pre-2011 magazines, of course. Perhaps this should have been an indication to the imminent end of these regimes. This is from Rahiddin Labad in Egypt. The current comics magazines that are filling the gap from these state-owned magazines as well maybe signify what is to come, whether it's a very commercial kind, catering to the market of children's needs and desires, and these are fun, very humorous ones from Bassem, Saudi Arabia, 2010, or the more radical comics with imposing ideologies. It will be interesting, I think, to see what forms of comics will evolve as a result of the Arab Spring and the collapse of the totalitarian regimes, particularly with such an extensive history of visual communication and propaganda in its wake. I did not mention magazines such as Talk Talk and all those because I do not consider them propaganda magazines, particularly as they are not state-owned. It's not an institution that is trying to say something. They're young people giving their point of view. But anyway, this is a sample of hopefully the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can we ask some questions?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So I will start. And regarding the biography of Gaddafi and Nasser, and so I know that the one of Nasser was a co-production with a French artist, and was the same case also with the Gaddafi one?
Gaddafi was, I think, an Italian artist.
Okay, yes, possible.
Yes, an Italian artist. It was an Italian artist, and commissioned by the state of Libya, and came and took the documentation and then produced it.
And how do you know how many copies were produced and how they were distributed?
That's
or
a very good question. I only have a copy because my husband collected it in the 80s when he was already collecting comics from the Arab world because of his interest, and whenever he had a friend coming from another country to bring it. I do not know the quantity, but it was available in other countries, and we found it in Egypt, I think, and France, of course. In Europe it was available. Actually, he got it from Europe, but I don't know the quantity. No, I'm sorry.
And another question regarding the artists that are making like these magazines for children. You are also a teacher at the university, and teaching graphics and animation. So, I mean, behind the story that behind the story of a grandma's of being a suicide bomber. There are a scenarist and there is
Of course,
the
the illustrator. And
yeah. And how comes that there is this support? I mean, it's kind of.
Well, I do think that they must be the. Excuse me, finish your sentence.
No, that there is a long process of discussion before making it. So how comes that it's still published and?
I don't know even who drew those because they have a pseudonym. So it's a name because there are some of them that you can read the name and it appears many different times with completely different styles. And it's a girl's name, and I asked around a little bit as much as I could to locate them, and some said it's a guy with that name, and some say it's an Iranian. So I'm sure it's someone who's, I think, has conviction about what they're drawing. I don't think, no, the one with the grandmother is Palestinian. But I'm sure they draw with conviction. I don't think they're doing it for money, because many of these magazines are run by these political groups and funded by them. I think it's with conviction, but I have that question myself. Some of them I know them. In the more moderate magazines, I know lots of them. They may do it because they would like to do comics and they just want to be published, but not the extreme ones. And many of them live that life. I mean, I live in a conservative society, and so it's part of the way we eat and drink and breathe. It's not. It's okay that is represented, and it feels natural. But the more extremist ones, I truly think they're either part of the political party or religiously believe in the ideals that are being presented.
You have the numbers in that case and the distributions weight, or
the number of the books being distributed. Yeah. I'm now working on a survey on that, but it's very difficult because many of the publishers, the publishing houses, I have interviews in the coming month with some of them, but they don't seem to have. They keep losing track of how much they produce, and especially older ones. And they don't know how much is sold. Even if they know how much is being printed, of course, they don't know how much is sold and which is, given lost, because many of the bookshops, don't account for exactly all the things. It's now much more in control than it used to be. I mean, now with the computers and databases and that, it is a little more. But no, I'm not. I haven't been. That's really what I'm working on now with this database. I'm trying to locate all the publishers and ask on the level of marketing and distribution. But if I ask any Lebanese, very few of them have seen these magazines. I keep on asking my students, and of course not my small community, but whenever I see someone, do you read this magazine? Do you see this? What are your favorite comics magazines? Mostly, if anything, translated superheroes, or sometimes the Majid, or of course, a lot of people grew up on Ahmed. That was very present. But these newer ones, they're not wide distribution, and I don't think that wider readership. But I'm very impressed by the styles, because it says, I think we are producing now illustrators and comics artists and so on, and internet plays a big role in learning and in experimenting and putting their work out there to the public. And so many of these magazines, the contributors are living in different countries, and they send their drawings by email. So that is happening now. And so as someone seeing comics, I'm very happy. And at the same time seeing that they're experimenting with their styles. Not in the beginning, it was very heavily influenced by the Belgian school or the French school of comics, and their the Spirou and the Tintin and those. And so it's nice to see that the styles are varying, but it depends on how it's being used. Any other questions? Oh yes.
Has there been an attempt to transform the heroes or the characters or the stories of the comics into a film? Or today I would also think it could be possible to transform it into an electronic game.
Yes.
Using the same character or story.
Not any of the the comic magazines have been translated into an animation of these series that are known. Many of the series get suddenly discontinued. We're famous for that in the Arab world. Or, you know, depends on their who's. I mean, there's not so much fellowship, so it doesn't matter. Continue, it doesn't continue. Some people complain. If you complain, it doesn't matter. But no, nothing has been translated into animation. If anything, some things have been done in Egypt, yes, but I think at a much earlier stage. There were some comics characters, I'm talking 40s, 1940s and 50s. They had a comics character who was made into animation because of one person's interest. But no, we don't have that tradition at all. And there are very few of of course, the long-term comics could have been very interesting if they had done that. I mean, like Ahmad has characters that every kid knows, so it could easily have been done into an animation. Yeah.
Or even if you want to have
Yes, the games is of course very recent, and Jordan is doing a lot of gaming, by the way. They're like each Arab country has a sort of direction. You know, Lebanon is going to the experimental adult comics, and Egypt is also adult comics that's addressing social issues and political, and Morocco and Tunis. But Jordan, I think, is going into trying to fill the niche of gaming. And I know of many little small companies who are doing gaming with cartoon characters. Also, Lebanese artists were drawing for them, and they outsource to. I just heard that today. Philippine professionals come from Philippines who are doing all the work, sweatshops, in Jordan. So they are doing the coding and the more digital aspect of it in Jordan. Yes, so I don't know, did I answer all your questions? Or?
Yes, I was thinking about if I want to make propaganda and influence the people.
Oh yes, you think that would be a good place. There are definitely some websites and internet comics, but not in the gaming or in animation. No, it's a good place. They should hear your comment. Yes.
Could you?
No, both. I don't know.
I'm wondering how much influence has the Western culture and the Western comic culture in these areas. Are they seen as part of the Western imperialist system, and because of this considered as hostile or something which is not appropriate, or are people adopting some alternative comics which might have some critics of religion in it, and
yes, many are doing that, but no comics is not seen from Europe or the States or that as something. I don't think we're so heavily into manga yet. Some places in Jordan and Syria a little more, I think, but they are not seen as propaganda, except by probably maybe more extremist or religious institutions or political, people with a political agenda who have the West as the evil, right? So, and no, every kid adores the comics that they're getting from abroad, and if it's translated, then doubly so. And I can say about Lebanon, of course, they read a lot of French and English comics, so the influence was there early on. In Syria, the influence was more Russian because of the Russian and East European, so because you had much more of the communist, socialist background, so whether it's in the architecture or in the children's books, and the cartoons we used to watch on TV was always Russian, or Polish and Bolek Lolik and others, over and over and over again. So the influence there, but now, of course, that's changing. We have the internet. I think everything's open now. The very small amount of comics that was entering into Syria was by somebody buying it in Lebanon, and even if it's basic like Asterix and Obelix or Tintin or those. So a lot was translated. You can't forget Disney comics are all translated. Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and all that are translated and adapted. Sometimes they wear Egyptian clothes and so on. Very much so, and very well liked. Who said God is homosexual? No, not God, sorry, Jesus Christ is homosexual. So they were called in for interrogation for 8 hours. They were asked to, not all of them were in Lebanon, and the ones who were out were afraid to go back because they were going to be, there was a big question of should they be taken in to prison, etc. So there are clear lines, and we had 2 debates before a few days ago, and they were asking about if there was censorship in the Arab world. And the North African, I could say, said no censorship at all. We're free, we can say whatever we want. And the Lebanese are like, what do you mean we're free? Can you talk about homosexuality? Can you talk about nudity and cohabitation? Can you talk about God or religion? And I don't think they've pushed those boundaries as much because they've acquired a more recent, personal comment, a more recent freedom that they're very, happy with, and and much deserved freedom. Finally, the Lebanese have been a little more liberal and in that freedom, able to push some boundaries, and so there have been in clashing moments much more. I forgot what I was saying. Anyway, I hope that answered your. Yes, there are some really nice efforts that are fantastic that are. Talking about different issues and towards adults, especially now in Egypt with the Tok Tok and the Ninth Art and many other magazines, and with Shafi'i's Metro magazine. Metro was the first graphic novel in Egypt, and it was in 2008, published before the revolution. And he was there. All the books were pulled in from because of the language used and addressing the political issues and the corruption in the police violence. So. They were called in for interrogation. Yes, I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, do you have any information about the situation in the Gaza Strip with regards to comics? Are they on an embargo list by Israel? Are they smuggled in? Are they produced inside the Strip?
Some of them are produced inside the Strip, and some of them are produced in Saudi Arabia or other Arabic nations with funding from or with Palestinian artists, but they tend to be a little more mixed, not entirely Palestinian. They're very hard to get hold of. There was, now with the internet, we're able to collaborate a little bit. We're meeting through such things such as Erlangen Festival and other comics festivals. We're able to start to meet up with each other and see each other's faces, which is a fantastic experience, and I'd like to thank Erlangen very much and the organizers, because many of them we know each other but we've never met. So it's a much smaller scale. There are many projects that were started that were stopped due to problems with funding or ability to draw, or they left the country. There was the Palestinian project that was fantastic but completely stopped in Gaza. So I don't have enough information about Palestinian comics because I really can't access it. So I don't know what the limitations are and so on. If anyone knows, please, I would love to receive information. But now I got a few contacts in Ramallah and Gaza, so I'm trying to get hold of what's going on. But it will probably be nothing really published, most likely unpublished work.
What about Israel itself? Because from my Arab friends living in Israel, I hear that there is some repression of Arab culture.
Yes.
Do you hear anything about that?
Yes, of course. I mean, we hear about the repression of Arab culture, but they have. I don't know if your question is like, I've seen the animation series that are Israeli that are, of course, very heavily anti-Arab, that are. Circulated on the internet a lot. They have many series I've seen, and also comics. But what were you saying? Were you saying the Israeli comics that is pro-Arab, or not? The opposite.
Comics produced by Arab Israelis.
Ah, Arab Israelis. I don't know if there is comics produced by Arab Israelis. I would love to know. I have no knowledge on that. I'm sorry to say. It's hard to get to all the Arabs in general, and it's very difficult. So many people ask, could you please get me comics from Jordan, let's say, whenever you go there, because it's very difficult and so on. And they say there's no comics, and then I meet all these comics artists, and then I say someone who's going to, of course I can travel, and I do travel to some, but not every corner of the earth am I able to go into. But so you ask friends who are there and artists who are there in different countries to bring them back with them, and it's very difficult, and the people don't, you have to explain what comics is, and then you have to explain what, you know, that it might be just for children, but so then they say, no, there's no books for children, but there was one for adults, but I didn't get it for you. I want the adult one too. So it's a little bit difficult. It's a newish field, and it's the trend isn't rising. Even though it existed a long time ago, it's not so much a culture of reading comics. Really. I think that's
just last one.
okay.
What about the distribution channels? What is the regular distribution channel for these types of comics? Is it the bookstore? Is it the
Yes.
newspaper stand? Is it official channels,
There you
private
go.
channels?
Those two specifically. Bookstores and newspaper stands. Much more likely that you'd find them at newspaper stands, but all bookstores will have an area for publications and newspapers, and then you'll have a whole level of Arabic comics, French comics, magazines, publications, there are periodicals. So those are the two places. Of course, if there is some political party gathering, then you'd find probably the publications at those more available. And different areas have higher density. I will not find it in the eastern Christian side of Beirut, any of these. But in the western, more Muslim section, I find them very, very readily available. So it depends really how but in the bookshops that's franchised, like Virgin Bookstore, the Virgin Mega Bookstore has all these comics in Lebanon, as far as I know. But also in Egypt, now they have in Egypt comics books stores that are more heavily comics entirely, and that's a rarity. You will not find that in other Arabic countries. I mean, that's dedicated to comics, and I'm very excited about the whole mood in Egypt, extremely, because it's very vibrant, and their magazines are working and they're being produced, and they're running out of when they publish them. They 500 copies instantly gone. They make 1,000 copies instantly gone. I mean, it's even working commercially. This is a dream, I think, for all of us. That is not happening. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm very impressed that anybody's even interested. Thank you so much for your questions.